Welcome to NewYorkBIO's virtual breakfast series, a digital program started in 2020, bringing you fireside chats with leaders from across the healthcare spectrum. In our final episode of 2020, we feature a discussion with Bob Easton, who's had a long and storied career as a biotech advisor and consultant, and is also a board member at NewYorkBIO.
In the office.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our last installment of the NewYorkBIO virtual breakfast series for 2020. Don't worry, we'll be coming back again in 2021. We next Tuesday. Is it next Tuesday? It is
next Tuesday.
I know. I can't believe it. Next Tuesday morning, instead of one guest, we will have as many of you who would like to join us. So we are going to do very similar to what we did with our networking receptions during our annual meeting for those 2 evenings. And we will have a networking breakfast. Yet again, it's bring your own coffee. It is 2020 and we're coming to you sort of from all over. So now we have the very distinct privilege of welcoming Bob Easton to join us today. He virtually needs no introduction, but we are very thankful to have VWR sponsoring this session as well as the other sessions in November and December of our breakfast series. So without further ado, I will kick it over to Derek to introduce Bob, and then we'll have a conversation. Oh, and also I almost always forget this. Don't forget, please ask your questions. You can do it either in the chat box or the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of your screen. So we look forward to the conversation. Derek, it's all yours.
Good morning, everybody, and good morning, Bob. Thank you so much for joining us today. And I was thinking about how to kick things off appropriately today. And since we've known each other for more than a decade, I will say that one of my absolute favorite things about talking to you about things in biotech is where I would bring up something or ask a question or things, and you would say, yes, I did that 15 years ago here, and you already were 15 years ahead of me, and you already had kind of gone through that here, there, or everywhere, and it was always one more facet to your background that I hadn't known about. So I'm excited to get into as much of that as possible this morning. So first and foremost, thank you very much for joining us.
Well, it's a privilege to be here, Derek. And I love NewYorkBIO, as you know.
So I thought one of the good ways that we might be able to kick off this morning is, maybe to talk a little bit and give the audience a little bit of background around, I would say, probably one of the more, formative instances throughout your career, which is kind of the formation of the Wilkerson Group, and talk a little bit about how the group came to existence and some of the bigger things that they were able to do really throughout their history, because it's, in terms of, advisory and strategic leadership, they were pretty much the best for quite a long time.
Thank you, Derek. Wilkerson was originally something called Channing and Weinberg. It had been started up by Barry Weinberg and Walter Channing, two guys who were brilliant and had developed a little consulting business based on devices. They were the experts in non-invasive diagnostics, in non-invasive surgery, endoscopes, bronchoscopes, all that kind of stuff. I'd been with the diagnostics division of Union Carbide, which at the time was a huge chemical company. They've been absorbed by Dow after Bhopal. And the business was sold. I was loose. I was divorced, so I didn't have any, I didn't have any big obligations. And I was tired of the big companies, and I was looking to start a company, actually. And in fact, I was fortunate enough to team up with one of my colleagues from Union Carbide Europe who had an invention. So we were trying to start a company, trying to raise money. It was called Fotes. But I had to support myself. I wasn't poor, but I did have to support myself. And I looked around for a consulting group to work with. And I shouldn't tell this, I won't tell the whole story, but I did actually come to an agreement with a smaller consulting firm called Robert First, and I did some due diligence, smart enough, lucky enough. And in the process, I ran into John Wilkerson, who was by that time was was actually the guy running the consulting practice for Channing and Weinberg. And I liked them better than First. They were just a more sophisticated group and more ambitious. So I kind of joined them, but on a contract basis because I was still doing the startup. But you know, the startup, the investors in the startup decided I was a better consultant than CEO. So they kind of made the decision for me. I certainly didn't start out a career to become a consultant. I thought I was an operating guy, and I really kept that fiction for a very long time. But anyway, so I hooked up with, I joined Wilkerson on a contract basis, and I became, first I did a lot of work in diagnostics. I'd come out of diagnostics. That was the time, you know, in-office testing and decentralized testing was really growing almost organically. And there was other stuff going on there. Yallo had just invented or just been given the Nobel Prize for immunoassay. There's a funny story with me and my wife where we spent one afternoon talking about immunoassay. This was our first date, which
and she still married you?
If you read my bio, as both of you have, you know that the circumstance is more complex than that. But anyway, so immunoassay
Jeff is clearly a saint.
You know, immunoassay was becoming, getting established. So that was an important new component to diagnostics. And so I did a lot of work in diagnostics. I just continued doing what I'd come out of a diagnostic business. And that continued and that continued. At some point, John was this very charismatic guy. Many of you know him or have seen him. Very charismatic guy with very high standards. John, I mean, this is silly, but it's absolutely indicative. John is the best proofreader that you'll ever find. He is meticulous about things being right, and just an ethical guy, a lot of integrity. So we kind of did this little contracting stuff for a couple of years actually, but the time came when John sort of turned around to me and said, you know, like a put up or shut up, are we going to build a consulting firm or not? And, you know, I realized I wasn't going to be the CEO. So I said, yeah, I'll join. And we committed ourselves to building a really substantial consulting firm. John was the leader. We recruited two people, Harry Toronto and Lisa Shapiro's Strobing's father, Steve Shapiro. Mm-hmm. This was the core of a really strong group of people. We also had a lady named Melissa Sabino, who was actually smarter than any of us, but perhaps too shy for those days anyway. So we committed to build a consulting firm. And we went through a little planning process, and you know, we wanted to build something substantial. So we went through this simple little exercise. What are the bigger segments in healthcare? And of course, hospitals came up, and I went out and I promoted a couple of projects in the hospital sector. I found this was back in the 80s now. I found the hospitals terrible clients. The politics were just I couldn't stand it. So we said, oh, no hospitals. What's next biggest? Pharmaceuticals. Well, I didn't know anything about pharmaceuticals, but I realized or learned pretty quickly that it was by far the biggest segment in healthcare, in commercial healthcare, and also the most profitable. So I put together, we had this wonderful franchise. Every drug company in those days was interested in diversifying. The industry had lost faith. They didn't believe in their science. Everybody was diversified. They were looking at imaging companies and diagnostic companies and PC companies. We looked at everything for them. So we knew all of them, not as pharma experts, but as device and diagnostic experts. I set out to do a little multi-client and industry study. People used to do that. They don't do it anymore. But there were lots of multi-clients out in the marketplace.
Oh, right.
So I decided to develop or write a big multi-client about the pharma industry. And I was very ambitious. I called it Success Strategies for the Pharma Industry. It was, you know, we said it $30,000 or something like that. We sold about 20 copies to 20 major pharma companies. Every one of them invited us in to talk to the board or their executive committee at least. And so with that, we established ourselves as people who knew something and had some good ideas about pharma. And the pharma business just exploded after that. We grew that. When I joined Channing and Weinberg, diagnostic was probably 10% of the practice. Device was 90, pharma was 0. By the time we sold it in 1996, pharma was 2/3, of which half, or 2/3 of 2/3, about a half was top 20 companies. So we went from zero, literally zero, as pharma strategizers or planners or market assessors to half the practice. And that's what made, we were the experts in devices, particularly in cardiovascular, under the leadership of Steve Shapiro. I was introduced once as the top mind in diagnostics by the head of one of the diagnostics companies. So I think it's fair to say we had a pretty good diagnostic franchise. Mm-hmm. But what made the company and brought us to the attention of IBM, by the way, who eventually acquired us, was pharma. We ended up working for every pharma company in the world. I had personal relationships with everybody in the U.S. and Europe, but also in Japan. We were the go-to guys the go-to girls and guys for work in pharma. And you may remember this goes through the Clinton era, right? 1992, Hillary came in and tried to change the industry, completely failed, but formed the basis for Obamacare, of course. But the Clinton plan basically failed, but it terrorized the drug industry. And we kind of came in and, it's going to be okay, guys. Don't worry, guys. Doctors are going to reestablish dominance, which is one of my quotes. The other thing, by the way, another thing that really, really helped us a little bit earlier, 83 was DRGs, if you remember. DRGs was the first time any kind of any kind of economic controls were put on the industry.
What does DRG stand for?
Diagnosis-related groups.
There you go.
Had this, the breakthrough was, okay, there's 543 different things that the patient can suffer from. We're gonna pay the hospital certain dollars per DRG.
Right.
And it was a very good thing. Everybody uses it now, of course, around the world. I also wrote a multi-client in 83. The world was panicking. They really were. And in fact, one of our competitors, I can't draw this, but published a curve, which was, it was the future of healthcare spend in the U.S. as a fraction of
GDP. Yeah.
If you can sort of understand, it was a curve that went up, and here's DRGs, and it went down. Like a very dramatic curve. Well, that's not what I also published a curve, and mine was
more gentle.
Yeah.
And exactly,
maybe not quite that dramatic.
Well, and I was exactly right. I mean, that was the shape of the curve for healthcare spend in the U.S. for about 10 years after that. We did a job of forecasting. That helped a lot too. I mean, so anyway, so the Wilkerson Group was this wonderful. I was so lucky to get into it. I kind of fell into it. I didn't plan to be a consultant. I certainly didn't plan to be a pharmaceutical strategist, but we were the first ones to really set our minds to it. We were the biggest independent medical business consultant by far. When we sold IBM in 1996, we were 100 people or 99 people. We were by far the big dogs in the industry, and it was wonderful. It was really wonderful. It was a wonderful opportunity. Our timing was perfect. DNA, recombinant, immunoassay, microprocessors, all of these things were just coming into the industry as we started up our consulting business. So our timing, completely unknowing, of course, was perfect. And we just grew with the industry, and it was a wonderful opportunity. It got me to, I traveled around the world. I met the leaders of all of the major companies in the world. We were well known to all of the banks. We were involved in due diligence on all of the combinations. It was wonderful. And
do you feel?
Go ahead. No,
I was going to say, do you feel like the prevailing thinking and leadership throughout the biopharma industry, do you feel like it's changed dramatically over that period of time? Or do you feel like it's reasonably been pretty consistent in terms of what the industry is looking for in terms of, say, patient outcomes, et cetera? Or do you feel like there's actually been decent shifts in the way that the industry thinks about things?
Well, I think the most fundamental change is I think the management is much stronger in the pharma industry today than it was then. In those days, these were small companies. Pfizer was about a $1.5 billion company. Not the strongest management teams, not the strongest leaders. We were, we were able to impress people with some pretty simple concepts. The kind of companies were smaller, and they were less mature. Basically, they're much stronger today. They're much smarter. They're much better organized. They're tougher. They're harder to deal with. They're much more difficult clients than they were then. But I think the industry is much stronger today than it was then, and it's much bigger. I mean, all of this.
Yep.
I personally knew every CEO of the top 40 or 50 pharma companies in the world then. I don't know them today, nor does anybody. It's just
well, we not only have had growth, but we've had consolidation.
Sure. I mean, the industry just collapsed on itself, which it had to do. It was there was this big drug problem, which is actually a phrase that I coined back in my 1985 study. Big drugs. The industry runs and still runs on big drugs. You don't win by having a bunch of singles. You win by having one home run or double home run. And I kind of quantified all of that for the industry. And that's been kind of the guiding principle ever since, and it should be. And that was, it took a little, it's amazing that it took some outsider. And that's one of the things that a consultant sometimes can do. I was an outsider. I'd never worked in the pharma industry. I was smart. I knew a little bit about healthcare. And I stepped back and said, oh, wow, this is the way things actually working here. The other thing we did, Merck was the leader in terms of time to market for drugs. And everybody knew that, and nobody could understand it, and nobody was able to quantify it. We figured out a way to semi-quantify the advantage of fast to market, time to market. Yeah. And one of the things I kind of, what I recognized is that for the decade of the 80s, clinical development was the most important component of a drug industry, of a drug company. The best drug companies were the companies that were the best at developing drugs, and Merck was the best in the U.S., which is the most important market, and as we proved later in another multi-client, Glaxo was actually best in the rest of the world, and that's why Merck and Glaxo were number 1 and number 2 for many, many, many years.
2 of the pharma companies I've worked for.
Yeah, that's right. Made good choices. Well, one of the things I'm most proud of in the second multi-client, which I did in 92 or 93, I think, which was a global study, I did some serious work on sales productivity. And I concluded by use of a differential equation, which I wrote myself, so I'm very proud of that. I was an engineer, some of you remember. And I published this, and it's available in the Merck library somewhere. I concluded that the American pharma companies, the primary care companies like Astra, Merck, Pfizer, that they should grow their force. Not they could, they should grow their sales forces up to 7,300 people, which was really, really an outrageous thing to say. The same week that I published that, your boss at Merck, Mr. Vagelos, who's a brilliant scientist and not a brilliant strategist, I got to say, Vagelos announced that they were cutting the Merck sales force from 2,900 to 2,300. Vagelos and he believed that the days of detailing were over. It was all managed care, all going to be centralized. So Merck cut their sales force from 29 to 23. I told Merck, or recommended to Merck and Pfizer and Astra, by the way, and Glaxo and some others, that they should grow it up to 7,300, which was also outrageous. That's exactly where Astra and Pfizer ended up. Until managed care really took over, which wasn't until the early 2000s. Yeah, selling was the way to sell drugs, and the way to sell more drugs was to have more sales force. And ground, and I was right. And very proud of that too. But Merck went from number 1 to number 6 because they didn't pay attention. I haven't ever told Angelos, by the way, don't.
So I wanted to also spend a little bit of time talking about diagnostics. You spent I think around 12 years on the board of Cepheid. And, I think one of the things that's important here is to think about how, and I phrased this to you this way the other day, how did we get to where we are in terms of diagnostics? If we think about, 2020 as a lens on this, we had, the opportunity in the first half of the year to have this concentrated rollout of diagnostics for COVID that really, honestly, could have helped things go a lot differently, right? And we didn't, right? So, what do you think happened?
Well, there's 2 problems in diagnostics. One is inherent and one is historical. The inherent problem is, despite the value of diagnostics, basically what you get paid for, the most valuable diagnostic tools are things that rule out. They're tests that don't do this test, that you don't have this disease, don't take this drug. They're rule out. Those are the most valuable because they're the easiest to quantify. It's hard to rule in. If I tell you you've got MS, now you've got $100,000, $200,000 of you've got a lifetime of pain and cost. But if you rule out, you really save people money and trouble. It's very hard to get paid for the value of a rule out. People are very willing, and doctors particularly, and it's a good thing about doctors, they're very willing to pay for a rule in. They're very, very happy to not to pay for a rule in, to pay for the cure for a rule in.
Mm-hmm.
Get somebody to pay a lot of money for a cure is relatively easy. To get people to pay a lot of money for a rule out that says, don't worry about this, go on to something else, it just doesn't have the same emotional impact, and it's not rewarded as well.
Yeah.
That's an inherent problem in diagnostics. It was true 100 years ago, and it's going to be true 100 years from now. You're never going to get paid as much you're not going to get paid as much of the value for a diagnostic as you will for a therapeutic. So that's inherent in the technology. There's a historical problem which maybe we're getting over finally. As I marked when I joined Wilkerson in 81, the immunoassay had was just becoming important. We developed these non-isotopic immunoassay tests. But the other thing that was growing quite quickly was actually point-of-care diagnostics. The glucometers were now on the market, and people were working on more sophisticated point-of-care tests, thyroid tests and TSH tests and hepatitis tests and things like that. So the technology for point-of-care was just getting started, and the market was just beginning to grow. And in fact, I did another big multi-client, I think in '83, in which we assessed, we concluded that point-of-care diagnostics was going to grow 10 to 12% per year in the U.S. And it did. It was, again, my forecasting luck is quite high. We did a very thorough analysis of, how many practices would do how many tests at such and such a reimbursement, and a lot of data behind a simple forecast. Well, the industry, the diagnostic point of care, in fact, was growing about 10% per year, just about what we forecast. In '87, some congresswoman's wife, I think, died of cervical cancer. And she died of cervical cancer because her pap smear had been processed by what we used to call pap mills, pap smear places where cytologists would do, hundreds of pap smears a day. They just glance at it. It was slightly scandalous. This generated a congressional investigation. The result was legislation that limited the rate at which you could do pap smears. But, having opened Pandora's box, somebody said, well, you know, these doctors are making a lot of money on useless tests that they're doing in office because they're getting paid well for it. So they looked into the whole in-office testing. Mm-hmm. And as a result, CLIA came. CLIA came out in 1988. And CLIA made it harder to run stuff in office. And it also regulated pap smears. And the in-office diagnostic business went from a 10% growth to a minus 3% growth in 1 year. It just killed that business. Every diagnostic company, many with a lot of help from me and our firm, had, you know, there are a lot of CEOs, diagnostic general managers and CEOs who'd invested in in-office diagnostics.
Sure.
And the bonuses in 89 for diagnostics were not nearly what they were in 87.
Yeah.
You know, everybody missed their numbers. Everybody missed their numbers.
And now you project that forward, right? So now you have LabCorp and Quest who have basically dominated all that with, you know, tests that, you know, they drive the price down. They're not, you know, they're not high cost tests. So it's hard to compete against them in virtually every single facet of business.
That's actually another element of the death of in-office testing, because about the same time, managed care organizations, you know, that form was getting bigger and stronger, and they negotiated deals with Quest and LabCorp that with directed testing deals, where if your doctor is in this managed care plan, he has to send his in-office test to LabCorp.
Right.
So this directed testing was also put in place about the same time. So the whammy, the punch in the stomach that in-office testing suffered was actually double. It was CLIA, which made it harder to do, because you had CLIA regulation now, and it costs more to do that. And number two, the managed care organization put in place directed testing protocols because the LabCorp of the world were offering a much better prices. So it was a double hit. And you know, that's been that's been a break on in-office testing ever since.
Yeah. And now this year we've had this conversation about, you know, everyone's used to the rapid strep test, or I mean, there are some things obviously that point of care testing has been durable, right? And then now I think with COVID and the test times and just the sheer volume of testing, all of the national labs are obviously, you know, doing their best to increase capacity. But what do we need to be thinking about as far as bringing back more in-office or point of care testing?
Well, and some of this is happening kind of automatically, but the reimbursement has to be able to, you know, it's got to accommodate that. It's got to make it possible. So that's one thing. I've been a believer for decentralized testing in my whole career. And to me, the model is very simple. If I need to, you know, if I need to solve some differential equation, I don't go to a central laboratory and put some cards on a machine, which is what we did when I was in college. You know, everything is local. It's all on your PC. I mean, everything anybody can do with a computer in 1967 when I graduated. It's all on your PC. Who the heck would go across the street even? Who'd go out? I wouldn't go to the other side of my house. That PC right here. So I just have this fundamental belief that point of care is where all of this stuff should be done. And I also have this belief that it's more cost effective. It's more cost effective. There's less handling. There's fewer mistakes. Things happen faster. Well, you know, with much better information systems, with more sophistication, with more AI, with all of the developments that have sort of come around all of healthcare, not just diagnostic, you know, you can make it's easier. It's more possible to make the economic case.
Yeah.
So that some of these things are just, you know, the weight of reality is finally seeping through, and people are making decisions that are more rational because they're based on better data and better technology. Of course, the technology is better too. One of the breakthroughs for point of care testing I've invested in, it's called Sandstone Diagnostics. It's they market a centrifuge that's about as big as slightly bigger than my coffee cup. That's something that's been lacking for years. We haven't had a way a really convenient, simple way to do separation of serum and plasma for the really high sensitivity assays. There are lots of technologies that involve paper separations or chromatographic separations. Those are fine for glucose or cholesterol. They're not fine for TSH, and they're certainly not fine for, free-floating DNA it's eventually going to prove to be the marker for early detection of cancer. So yeah. Technology is helping us, and, with a better separation device, I think we're going to have more and better separation at the point of care. Yeah. So it's kind of the weight of reality is taking over here. Why didn't we respond better to COVID? I think part of it is the residual in the diagnostic industry and the management of conservatism about new things. That just, we've been disappointed so many times by regulation and other and reimbursement issues. I don't think they were quite ready to gear up to invest as much as should have been done. Yeah. To get all of this stuff in place.
Well, it's interesting. I wonder if we're seeing the pendulum swing back in some ways, not necessarily towards what I would call diagnostic companies, but companies that are predicated on the value of health information. Yeah. Right? You can look at companies like Tempus, or these other companies that don't build themselves as diagnostic companies, but build themselves as companies to help people stay healthy and to help people manage their conditions. Under another umbrella, I mean, they're doing diagnostic type tests, but what they're gathering is additional health information and using that to help people make decisions. And those companies are now actually spinning this in a high value way, which of course is what's supposed to happen with better uses of health information. So it may not be called diagnostics, on the label or on the door, but in a way, the value of health information is going up in certain areas, which is interesting and which is good, right? And they're actually flipping they don't need to replicate what Quest or LabCorp have in terms of distribution. They don't need the white cars driving around everywhere, but the infrastructure is different, and quite honestly, the information is different. The level of either sequencing or advanced assays. They're kind of taking tests that solve for individual problems rather than trying to figure out, which Hep B test you should get or anything like that.
And interesting, this just occurred to me, Derek. I mean, that's right. It's information. It's more sophisticated use of information. The potential, the data is out there, right? The information is all over the place. The potential for all of this is for sure there. I don't think there's this. I have this is a little survey that we should do. Maybe I could get the med tech people to do this, but I don't think there's a single diagnostic company leader who grew up as a software engineer. I don't think there's one. There are people that have been in the chip business. There's certainly been in instrumentation business, but I don't think there's a single major leader of a diagnostic company who grew up as an information specialist.
Right. I would say probably the closest we're getting now is Jonathan Rothberg, who was runs For Catalyzer, started Butterfly. I think that's probably the closest thing we have to it now.
And what that means, of course, is don't be surprised if everybody's talking about this. I think one of this will happen if we end up with Amazon or Google actually getting into the diagnostics business.
Hey, Bob.
Yep.
Technical, we're getting some messages that your audio is still low. So yes, to the extent you can project or sit closer to the mic, that may be helpful.
I will get closer.
Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, that's better.
And on the point of care front, it's interesting because I think there are companies that, I hadn't heard of that I noticed raising reasonably large rounds that are all trying to move into the. I think the industry has recognized that you know, part of the consumerization of healthcare means that people are going to be both, you know, trusted and leaned on more to create their own information, right? And that's a trend that seems to be happening whether hospitals or providers want it to or not. And there's a gray line between information like your fitness information and number of steps you take in a day versus, you know, actual, you know, actionable health information that people are going to trust. And that line is going to go away at some point.
And those are things that your typical diagnostic executive has no real feeling for, because she wasn't in it. They didn't do it.
Yep, and that's not a good place for them to be.
And remember, they're not going to get paid big dollars for that. They're going to get paid small dollars, lots of small dollars, right? But it's not. There's you have to figure out ways to get paid. You have to figure out ways to figure it and then value it and then get paid for it, and it's complex.
Right? Yeah. No, that is not. That is absolutely non-trivial. And the way that the real interesting thing is for the consumer or for the actual person taking these tests in their kitchen. When does it switch over to something that everyone is comfortable that their insurance is going to cover it versus this is something I feel strongly about and would happily start paying for out of my own pocket? You know, I certainly don't think we're in the first category yet, but you know, ultimately it seems like the outcomes should be there, and it seems like we'll get there. It's just a squiggly line that no one can quite draw the date that we're going to get there on it.
Okay, but therein you can see why the pharma companies are richer than the diagnostic companies and why they continue to get investment. If I have a cure for hepatitis, you know, very easy.
Mm-hmm.
Easy to, you know who is going to get it, you know who to treat, and you can measure the outcome. You can see the outcome, number one. You can see the outcome, you know, healthy patient, and two, you can measure it. And so it's just a lot easier to value, to reward, to promote cures, therapeutic cures than mostly on the drug side. And this problem is never going to go away. It's just going to chip away at it, and at some point, an integrator, which maybe is Abbott Diagnostics or Danaher, or maybe it's Google or Amazon, an integrator is going to have all the pieces and be able to see how to actually combine them all and measure and value them all. There will be a huge change at some point in time, but it's very complex.
Yeah.
Well, and also you have, I mean, another piece of the complexity, right? And we're seeing this with COVID tests in the home is, do you have to be monitored by some sort of a healthcare professional, lab technician, whoever it is, right? While you're swabbing, poking, spitting, or whatever the method of specimen collection is.
You know, by the way, just to step back a minute in defense of the diagnostic companies, just a little bit, there's a supply chain. There was a supply chain issue for them 6 months ago, just as there is right now for Pfizer.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. There now, okay. It wasn't all kind of foot dragging on the part of diagnostic companies. They needed certain materials that just weren't available or were in short supply. I mean, and one of the, as you know, I'm sure Derek, one of the problems that Pfizer has is that it's an RNA vaccine. So some of the raw materials used to make that vaccine are the same raw materials that the diagnostic industry has been, scoured up to be able to meet the demand for tests. So there are some, sort of the pandemic overwhelmed a whole bunch of things, hospitals and ICUs, and also certain manufacturers of necessary for both testing and eventually
we learned that one of the two largest cities in the world that makes swabs is in Italy and was decimated by the coronavirus, which is one of the reasons that no one could get swabs to test anybody for the coronavirus, because 30% of the world's production was wiped out for however long. And that led to, you know, my wife and I spent a weekend at Columbia with their whole engineering team trying to figure out ways to manufacture nasal swabs if we could do it. Yeah. You know, so it just, you're right. There's one of the things that, funnily enough, we've now almost become accepting of is the fact that this has, you know, highlighted some real, you know, flaws and challenges in our whole supply chain. You realize that it's much more complex than anybody ever gave it credit for.
Well, I mean, and let's be honest, it's not just diagnostics supply chain.
Yeah.
It was literally the world's supply chains from food.
We were worried about glass.
Yes.
Right? Yeah. How many glass vials could the world produce in order to vaccinate everyone in the world against this disease? That was a real calculation that people were trying to make. You know, does enough medical grade glass exist in the world to do the vaccinations that we're thinking of here?
So anytime you get hit with a tidal wave, the world is most of the stuff is very complex, in fact.
Yes.
And it's only by, you know, working on it for years that you know, the supply chains get established and the relationships get established and the know-how gets established. And COVID has just overwhelmed all of that stuff.
Yeah.
We have Bob, we have a few questions. One, I'm gonna take the easy one first. From our friend Joel Papernak, what is your most satisfying or substantial business accomplishment? I'm sure it's New York Bio board member.
Yeah, after being a New York Bio board member, we're not going to give you the easy way out on that one.
This one is going to make me, well, the most impressive business thing was recommending the growth of the sales force in the U.S. when Merck was going the other way. But really satisfying is the following. Wilkerson was an advisor to a number of venture funds, including ATV in Boston. ATV was approached by somebody who had a machine for automating pap smears. Okay, there's a company called Cytyc, C-Y-T-Y-C. Mm-hmm. Palindromic. There were two pap smear companies, both with palindromic names. Cytyc came in and showed this thing, and ATV invited me in to watch. And when they left, well, what do you think, Bob? I said, well, look, that's a very complicated machine. I used to design diagnostic instrumentation many years ago. I said, that's a very complicated machine. I think there's a lot of risk in that. However, this little disposable that they've created to make this machine function a little bit better, I think that's got application somewhere in any case, and it may be good all by itself. That was called ThinPrep. Okay, mm-hmm. So ATV invested. The machine failed. We took ThinPrep into the clinic just as a better way to do the manual pap smear. There were some other hiccups there, by the way. But ThinPrep, I don't remember what year it got introduced, but the year that ThinPrep, but anyway, we supported the company. ATV invested, 2 or 3 rounds. I put some money in. ThinPrep was introduced in 19XYZ. That was the peak year for cervical cancer deaths in the U.S. Ever since the introduction of ThinPrep, cervical cancer has been less and less and less of a killer. And that, to me, is...
Yeah, that's a big deal.
That's the best thing I ever did.
So to stay on the topic of cancer a little bit, I thought it might be interesting to talk about some of your work with Gilda's Club, which, it's interesting. I was thinking this morning that, I know who Gilda Radner is and whatever. And now that I'm thinking that I'm, since I'm no longer 25, I'm 26 this year. It's possible that not everyone necessarily knows kind of the legacy of Gilda Radner, even what Gilda's Club necessarily is.
Okay. In 96, we sold the Wilkerson Group to IBM. We brought in an administrative guy. His name was Frank Russo. His wife had been a founder of Gilda's Club in New York. Gilda's Club provides social and emotional support to people touched by cancer. And it's named after Gilda Radner, this great comedian, Saturday Night Live. who died of ovarian cancer.
Mm-hmm.
Her husband, Gene Wilder, and some other celebrities, Mandy Patinkin and Joel Siegel, decided, I don't remember the specific, but decided to start. Gilda had been treated by a psychotherapist by the name of Joanna Bull, and she found that extremely helpful in her life. And so Gene and Mandy went to Joanna and asked her if there were a way to, institutionalize a little bit what she'd done for Gilda. Joanna agreed, and they started Gilda's Club. And they started it here in New York. The idea was, a lot of conversation meetings, not focus groups, but help groups, and it's a very personal kind of a program.
Mm-hmm.
Ann Russo, who was the founder, had helped Joanna get this started in New York. So in '96, we made some money with the sale of IBM. In 1998, Frank Russo said, "Hey, Bob, come join our board, please." I thought he was asking me to, because I was such a great administrative person and so smart. Well, I found out later what it means to be, to join a board of a company like Gilda's Club. The program was a mess. The program was great. The administration was a mess. When I joined, there were 11 people on the board, myself and 5 married couples. The board meetings were one discussion after another. Discussion's a kind word, right? And I was in the line of succession, and about 2 months after the line of succession was established, everybody in between me and the chairmanship dropped out. So I in '99 or sometime, I don't remember exactly when, but I became chairman. And we struggled. Gilda's Club had deep financial problems. We were deeply in debt. We went through 3 or 4 CEOs. I won't libel anybody, but let's just say I'd never hire any of them again. And finally, and I did this. I said, enough of this. I said, I got the board to agree that we were gonna get serious. We went out and did a real search and looked for a strong CEO. We found her. Her name is Lily Stefani. She's still there. Gilda's Club is now a very strong organization under her leadership. And by the way, one thing I'm really proud of, I don't have the dates exactly right, but on a Friday in March, Lily and her staff concluded that the in-person program, which was the centerpiece of Gilda's Club, groups and the lectures and the yoga classes, that was all going to be killed by COVID. They made a decision to go virtual. And on Friday night, they made that decision. On Monday morning, they, quote, opened the door on the virtual program. And and since then, membership's gone up about 10%. The activity's gone up about 50%. It's a huge success. Gilda's Club is doing more and more good for people touched by cancer now than they ever did before. And it's because of COVID, because of the learnings of COVID.
Yeah.
Lily is still in charge, and she's a spectacular CEO. And we have a great board. Bill Slattery's the chairman. He's the number 2 at Deerfield. We have the best drug analyst on our board. We have a number of very distinguished people. And it's a great organization. And it's on good, we're still a little bit in debt, but not nearly where we were.
Well, we can, for those of you who might be interested who are watching, Lily is fantastic, and Gilda's Club obviously does very important work. And we will obviously share the information on Gilda's Club. So to the extent anyone feels moved to engage or make a donation, we'll obviously make that easy for you.
Yep.
One of the things, I've been on a number of boards, and I've learned a little bit about board politics over the years. Not all good things. But when I became chairman, when Jennifer's predecessor asked me to be chairman, I said yes. A little segue on that one. I always thought that somebody from Wilkerson Group should be on the board of NewYorkBIO. NewYorkBIO started in we were still the Wilkerson Group anyway. And nobody ever invited me, but finally, I think Joel Papernick convinced the board that I, in fact, was the CEO. I was running this company of 20 or 30 people, and so they invited me to the board. And then, 2 years after I was invited to the board, over the objections of some of the board, they invited me to be chairman. So that's how those things work. Anyways, one of the things I did when I became chairman, I realized I might need some allies, and I invited Lily to sit on our board, which I think was a pretty good move. So she is a wonderful CEO. She's just a wonderful CEO. She's probably the best kind of, Jennifer excluded, of course, the best nonprofit.
I always like the present company excluded.
I'm very proud of Gilda's Club.
Yeah, no, such amazing work.
And the program is spectacular, and it's got great leadership and great people. It's wonderful. I'm very happy about it. Very lucky about it.
So to take us,
Thank you for the bone there, Derek.
well, I've got one more, right, and it's gonna take us through the end, and I'll talk to you about probably the worst prediction that you've ever made.
Yes.
So you can take that ball and run with it if you'd like, or I can set it up.
I'll get there. In 2000, by the way, so I've been consulting now since 1981 around the world. Clients everywhere: Australia, Japan, Israel, all of Europe. I consider myself a global person. Some of you may know before I got into the medical business at Union Carbide, I spent 5 years in Europe, and I've just always considered myself a global person. And in the U.S., I worked. People used to ask me, "Do you have any clients in New York?" No. No. California, Chicago, and Florida, New Orleans, even some in Texas. So anyway. Almost lost my train there. So I didn't worry too much about the local economy or the local bioeconomy in New York, but I always thought we should be part of it. And I told you the story. I mean, the board didn't think that part of the board didn't think that a head of a consulting firm should be on the board. It should be only CEOs of drug companies. Well, we'll finally go over that. So I became president. I became chair. I joined the board and then became chairman. And so sorry for the segue. In the year 2000, when I started a new consulting firm after leaving IBM, we did a multi-client on the future of the pharma industry. This is an old trick that I developed, and I did it over again. And our conclusion was that, that the science was getting a little old, and we thought that by 2010, the pharma industry would be where it was back in 1980, i.e. out of ideas. And so we were projecting, kind of a leveling off. And the corollary was when I became chairman of Gilda's Club, of New York Bio, and started thinking about our future, I thought, oh my goodness, well, Boston and the Bay and San Francisco, and also San Diego at the time,
yep,
were more important than New York was in biopharma and biotechnology. And I concluded that, the game was sort of, we were in the eighth inning, and, we were doomed to be also rans. And, I was completely wrong, thankfully. Now, I wrote a paper on this, by the way, which I can't burn it because it was so long. My conclusion back in 2012 was, I'm here to shepherd the ship, to the ship graveyard, maybe. Maybe not that extreme. Anyway, I was not optimistic about the future of biopharma or biotechnology in New York City or New York State. And what's happened, of course, is the science is so deep and so rich and so broad that it's just overwhelmed anything that I was thinking about. The explosion of science that's come about because of the Genome Project and other things is just, and we are the beneficiary of that. New York more than any other region has really been the beneficiary of that. So New York Bio is thriving in ways that I did not expect in 2012. I can tell you that. I am thrilled with what's happened here. I wish I could take some credit for it. I was on the wrong side of it. But we've just, with your leadership, Jennifer, with your leadership, Derek, with the board, a new board, which I recruited part of, by the way, so I get a little credit. We've really kind of turned the ship around, and I think that 10 years from now, New York will be more important than Boston. Not very many people are going to agree with me on that, but it's really quite amazing how our industry, how our ecology ecosystem here has flourished over the last decade. And it's the science. It's fundamentally, I mean, it's not because of great, they're great people and great leadership and all that stuff, but it's all riding on the science. It's because the science has been so much richer and so much deeper, so much more important and broad than I understood or expected. And lucky for us, and I'm very glad to be part of it, and thrilled to be part of it, and proud of a small part.
Well, you may not have anticipated it in 2012, but your leadership really has been instrumental in helping, particularly New York Bio, to be able to connect the dots, do what we do, serve companies, try to create ways to connect, areas for growth, even like our business solutions program, right, which helps extend run rates for early stage companies. I mean, these are all things that took a lot of people working together and believing in our whole ecosystem. And I came in at just the right time as things were coming to fruition. So, and despite my Southern accent, I am fully on board with making New York the preeminent biotech ecosystem in the U.S.
So I'm going to tell a story on you, Jennifer. I remember, I think I wasn't, was I chairman when we hired you? No, Judy was.
Yeah.
My successor was chairman, but I was on the search committee. And the Patty, the search lady, remember Patty?
Yes.
She told me, I have a candidate. This is a farm girl from Mississippi.
You were like, what?
I interviewed the farm girl from Mississippi, and I found out that you have a big farm in Mississippi, right?
But fun fact for those who don't know and who don't know this, Bob Easton also lived in Mississippi at one point in his life.
Oh, Jennifer actually read my bio. I lived in Mississippi twice, actually, when I was a little kid. In fact, one of my great memories is my mother finding a rattlesnake under our front stoop and killing the rabbits, thereby protecting her children. Mississippi was an interesting time, interesting experience for me.
So see, there are many ways, and many paths to come to biotech in New York. We are particularly thankful that you came and you were our guest today. This was a fantastic conversation. And what a perfect way to close out our virtual breakfast series for 2020. Thank you again to VWR for sponsoring us. And we hope everyone has a great Tuesday and rest of the year. And we hope to see you in person on the screen next Tuesday morning for our conversation and coffee. Thanks, everybody.
Have a great week, everybody.
Bye-bye, guys.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for tuning in to NewYorkBIO's virtual breakfast series. Join us every Tuesday at 9 a.m. for more discussions with leaders from across the healthcare spectrum. For more information on New York Bio, please visit us at www.newyorkbio.org.